A warm welcome to this discussion on defining anti-Semitism, expectations and fallacies. And thanks to the Van Leer Institute and its director, Shai Lavi, for hosting this event. This discussion is organized by several institutions and people. The Bucerius Institute for Contemporary German History and Society at Haifa University, headed by Dr. Cedric Cohen-Scully, the Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University and its director, Amos Goldberg, the Stephen Roth Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism and Racism at Tel Aviv University and its director, Amos Mouris-Rייך, the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and its director, Manuela Consoni, and the Institute of Jewish Studies at the University of Antwerp, of which I'm the director. It is thanks to the joint efforts of the organizers who hold different points of view, but agree on the importance of this discussion that we are gathering here today. Briefly, the facts. Recently, there have been conflicting attempts at defining anti-Semitism, among them prominently, and as a critical response to the IRA definition, the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, the IRA, quote, non-legally binding working definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, was triggered by increasing instances of anti-Semitism in Europe and conceives of itself as a, quote, useful tool, in particular for education and training purposes. Its first version was issued by the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia. It was then, in 2005, was then established as the IRA definition in 2010, and is since 2016 adopted by over 30 countries, as well as several hundred institutions and organizations. The Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, the JDA, drafted in 2020 after 15 international scholars convened by Israel's Van Leer Institute worked together to write a document on anti-Semitism. And it presents itself as an alternative to the one published by the IRA, while also regarding the fight against anti-Semitism at its primary goal. The JDA challenges the IRA definition on several accounts, focusing primarily on the latter's approach to Israel criticism. The IRA definition designates disproportionate criticism of Israel, including applying different standards to Israel than to other countries, or calling for the boycott of Israeli products and people as anti-Semitic. The JDA rejects this and is critical of the IRA definition in general for lacking clarity as to what qualifies as anti-Semitic and what does not, that it impedes free speech in discussions on Israel-Palestine, and thus obstructs the dialogue with Palestinians. What is at stake here? Well, a lot. And today's event aims to highlight the importance of these divergent definitions on several levels, from concrete decisions, their role in policymaking, legal contexts, institutional programs, curricula and media reports, and more, to its impact on the discourse of Jew hatred in time and space. But there are even larger questions to ponder, questions that go beyond the justified concern about the current rise of anti-Semitism and the safety of diasporic Jewry, or the obvious question underlying this debate, the inseparable connection or not between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Some of these larger questions, so even larger questions, include the following. Can and should one transcend tribal concerns, or is one called to first protect one's own, remain loyal to earlier generations, including victims of previous violence? Does concern for others take precedence over the interest of one's own group? Or is it merely a self-aggrandizing claim to a certain moral high ground? Is this stark dichotomy a given, or can the square be circled? What are the criteria to decide on the limits of free speech? Is there a distinction between the semantic content and the pragmatic effect of a political declaration? Or, in other words, should one's concern in taking protective measures be dictated by previous evidence or potential risks in the future? What role is played by singular examples in those definitions, or by different rhetorical strategies? Do varying contexts and addressees, where loaded environments on both sides can create unintended allegiances, have to be taken into consideration? And finally, bridging the concrete and the general, the question of the function, the possibilities and limitations of definitions as such. Is there a need to define anti-Semitism? What are the aims as well as the advantages and disadvantages of having a definition, regardless of content? Who has the authority to define anti-Semitism? In this context, it is the so-called instrumentalization of anti-Semitism definition. Is it a real phenomenon or not? Definitions are meant to stabilize semantic meanings in view of a long-term general usage. Anti-Semitism is an age-old, murderous phenomenon that doesn't seem to disappear anytime soon. How justified is it to formulate definitions of anti-Semitism that focus on the politics of the present, in this case, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? The questions we will aim to discuss today are thus fundamental ones that deeply concern the intellectual as well as the responsible citizen of our time. This public conversation aims at highlighting the diversity and complexity of approaches to these questions in view of a more informed and lucid debate on a topic of perennial but also highly topical relevance. We are delighted that this discussion is taking place. We want to thank the speakers who agreed to present their views. And I will now give the floor to the three speakers who, from various perspectives and in different functions, are deeply and earnestly implicated in the questions to be debated here. Our three speakers are Stephanie Schuler-Springorum, Mוריס-רייך, and Amos Mוריס-רייך. So each one of them will present their views. We will then have a second round in the same order where each one has about 5 minutes, maybe a bit more, to respond to the statements of the other speakers. This will be followed by a Q&A with our listeners, and the speakers can then respond. I would like to invite all of you to put your questions either as a Facebook comment or in the YouTube chat for this discussion following the speaker's presentation and dialogue with each other. I will then communicate your questions to the speakers. And I would now like to introduce Stephanie Schuler-Springorum, historian since 2011, director of the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism, since 2012, co-director of the Selma Stern Center for Jewish Studies, both in Berlin, and since 2020, director of the Berlin branch of the Center for Research on Social Cohesion. Her fields of research are primarily Jewish, German, and Spanish history. Recent publications include 4 years after Anti-Semitism and Racism in Trump's America, Gender and the Politics of Anti-Semitism, and she's the author of Geschlecht und Differenz, Krieg und Fliegen, and Denkmalsfigur biografische Annäherung an Hans Litten, and the jüdische Minderheit in Königsberg. Stephanie, please.
Yeah, thank you very, very much, Vivian, for this introduction and for the great task that you've been giving to us. I think we could write a book on answering all those questions. What I will do is much smaller. I will give, as you said, my perspective on what is at stake here. And please let me start with saying one thing beforehand, which might be surprising, but I have to say it. Definitions are really not my cup of tea. As a historian, of course, I know they are important, and I'm aware of the fact that the development of the meaning of a certain term over the centuries, the so-called German Begriffsgeschichte, can be a fruitful means of understanding the past. But it's not by chance that I found the now famous article by our colleague David Engel away from a definition of anti-Semitism, so very thought-provoking, and I'm grateful to my colleagues Scott Urey and Guy Miron, who hopefully are listening now, for including me in their special number of Zion that dealt with Engel and with the question of definition from very different perspectives. So why did someone like me participate in an endeavor of writing a new definition of anti-Semitism then? The reason for this is twofold, and both have to do with me being German. So first, and this is the core of my statement, I guess, yes, there is anti-Semitism in Germany. And yes, it is on the rise. The official numbers of the German police for 2020, the numbers collected by NGOs, the day-to-day experience on the street, and last but not least, recent terrorist attacks in my country, they all point to this, as most of you will probably be very much aware of. But at the same time, they make something very clear that we already know from history. The anti-Semitic threat comes from the radical right in rise all over Europe, as we all know. And we also know, also from history, that anti-Semitism does not come alone. And even though I would personally, and as a historian, always insist on fundamental differences between anti-Semitism and racism, and I can expand on this later if wished, even though I insist on the differences, I'm absolutely convinced that we do not grasp the flexibility and the dynamics of anti-Semitism if we don't take into account its incredible capacity of entanglement with other forms of hatred as developed over the long course of its history. In our present moment in Europe, it seems that the reaction to the refugee crisis of 2015 somehow opened up the Pandora's box of hatred against people perceived as foreigners, or the black-haired ones, as the terrorist of Halle put it. And the Jews being either part of that group, the black-haired ones, or the wire puller in the background, or both. But they are always there. The attack on the synagogue in Halle is a clear example of this. The perpetrator aimed first at the Jews, and when that did not work, he aimed at the black-haired people in a doner kiosk, killing two of them and killing one of them and killing a woman who was getting on his nerve in between. To this group of potential enemies, Jews, foreigners, women, we can add politicians, lawyers, journalists, and small-town mayors who defend those people, refugees, people with black hair, non-Germans, or whoever you want to call them. And they also defend German democracy. By the way, as did the provincial governor Walter Lübcke, who was killed 2 years ago for taking a public stand for the refugees. So what we have here is what I call the tableau of hatred, the panorama of hatred, where the Jews, as I said, are always present and whose perpetrators always, in one way or the other in Germany, are bound to the Nazi time as their point of reference and maybe glory or whatever. I mean, there's always this connection there. The present pandemic has reinforced this tendency even more. Small wonder if one considers the history of anti-Semitism and it links to other pandemics. Today, it's not the well poisoning, but anything from creating the virus to creating the vaccine, by means of which we all become creatures of Bill Gates, who of course is Jewish. You can find this in abundance in the internet, as you know, and I can even find it in the WhatsApp status of some people that I have their phone numbers. So in short, yes, there is a problem. And no, the IRA definition does not really help in this situation, or better, maybe it could be even useful if its supporters would not instrumentalize it first and foremost for the political fight about Israel-Palestine. And to be very clear here as well, yes, there are anti-Semitic motivations to be found within German pro-Palestine groups, within the churches, for example, or on the left, no doubt. And I guess it's also a specifically German way of dealing with one's own family past. But this is by far not the main problem when it comes to anti-Semitism in Germany right now, as the numbers that I mentioned very clearly say, even those of the pro-IRA monitoring NGO RIAS, which just recently stated a heavy decline of more than 50% when it comes to Israel-related anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism on the left in general. And second, in the day-to-day life in Germany, the IRA has been predominantly used to silence not only Palestinian voices, but also Israeli ones, not to mention intellectuals and artists from all over the world who now have to sign a passus of not having been in touch with BDS before they come to Germany invited by state money. So I think that this situation is highly troubling in many regards, and ever more so since the BDS resolution of the German parliament was passed in 2019, and we can talk about this specific issue if you want later in the discussion. All this taken together is the reason why the idea of writing a new definition made sense, even to someone like me with a certain disdain or dislike of definitions in general, as I said. It is important because there's a need for clarity in education, in monitoring work, and in civil engagement more general. And I'm convinced, no surprise, that the JDA is the better definition, basically for 3 or rather 4 reasons. It is better and clearer, and let me please read out to you, for the sake of the argument and for our memory, the first defining phrase of the IRA and of the JDA so that we will have it present for our discussion. The first phrase of the IRA, the first defining phrase is, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. While the JDA states, anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews or Jewish institutions as Jewish. So I think we should leave it. I mean, we don't have the means now via internet to do a text interpretation from all the phrases, but I think it gives an impression of the difference in clarity. And second, the JDA covers more exhaustively or more intensively those forms of anti-Semitism, which are the main problem in Europe. That is, and we always forget this, religiously based anti-Semitism. Think of Poland, think of Hungary, think of the Orthodox Church in the former Soviet Empire. And all those forms of anti-Semitism, or that specific form to be better, you know, the specific form of anti-Semitism that relies on a fixed conspirational worldview. And third, the JDA is more precise and more subtle when it comes to Israel-Palestine, and especially so because it gives also examples of what in this context is not anti-Semitic and what is yes anti-Semitic. So it tries to be very balanced and to be very as precise as one can get in a situation where, of course, the context and who is speaking is also something to take into account. It is thus opening up, I think, a bitterly needed space that will allow for the separation of the political discussion of the conflict and its possible solutions from the fight against anti-Semitism, for the improvement and yes, maybe even the disintoxication, hopefully, of both. And fourth, by doing this, it creates a fundament that will allow for political and civil society and even academic alliances, very badly needed, not only as the German example shows. Thus, it has the potential of restoring the notion of universalism, of universally shared human rights to the fight against anti-Semitism. Not bad, I think, for just a new definition. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I will now introduce our second speaker, Mוריס-רייך. Raif is the academic co-director of the Minerva Center for the Humanities at Tel Aviv University and is associate professor at Ono Academic College, where he teaches jurisprudence, property law, law and culture. He's senior researcher at the Van Der Institute in Jerusalem. His fields of interest include legal and political theory, citizenship and identity, legal interpretation. Recent publications include The Ethics of the Intellectuals, Rereading Edward Said, Historical Justice on First and Second Order Arguments for Justice, Ronald Dworkin and Duncan Kennedy, Two Views on Interpretation, and Subject, Subjectivity and Subjugation, as well as Kant, Time and Revolution. Raif, please.
Yeah, thank you, Vivian. I would like to thank all the organizers for this event, for this extremely important and timely event. I'll make my comments relatively short. I would say less about content, would say more about form, probably in the first round, but I will end with some content. Why I think the GDA is important. But I would start as a Palestinian as well, located in a certain time, certain space. I would like always start from the concrete, the particular, the historical. Though I'm lawyer and trained also as a philosopher, we tend to think in the abstract, and we should always think about the time and the place from which we are talking. And we are talking 2021, not after Dreyfus, and we're talking after Israel not only is established, Israel is a state and a half. There is Israel, there's the occupied territories, and Israel clearly and openly claims that the two-state solution is dead. The disposition of Palestinians continues. Today, we witnessed that in East Jerusalem. So it's always important to bring back context to the conversation, because we tend, academics, to float over context. And whenever we say something, we say it from certain place, from certain point of view, at a certain time, within certain balance of power. And I want this to be on the table. And so I want to say something about definitions in general and about some of the sensitivities about definitions and the problematic probably nature, probably more for the Palestinian in definitions. So as Vivian said, definitions, they want to capture some semantic, to stabilize some semantic meaning in a endless context, political context, which is so extremely fluid. And this is not a national legislation to say. It's sort of a statement that should be used and deployed all over the world. So there is something between the over-fluidity of the context, of the potential political uses and misuses, with the relative or pretending stability of the definition, which is always over-inclusive or under-inclusive, and always is open for misuse and abuse. And usually the one who is able to abuse and misuse is the powerful party. Usually the powerful party is the one who has the last word on interpretation, the one who has the money, the public relations, the energy, the media, etc. So there's a problem here about the whole idea of definition. Now there is another thing And these are more like sensibilities, and I'm on purpose speaking about sensibilities because I want to put always things in context. The Palestinians are the weak party in this conflict. Militarily, economically, politically, in the media, in every possible sense. And the Palestinians are trying to gather power. And feeling that there is a definition that wants to condition the struggle, it's always a feeling that there is another mode of controlling their behavior in the form of another mode of ethical limitation on their behavior. Does that mean that those who are occupied, do they have carte blanche to do whatever they like to do? Of course not. But the issue is always who holds the interpretation, who holds the power to claim that the struggle of the Palestinian is anti-Semitic. So this is kind of censoring by definition. Whenever there is a definition, the Palestinians feel that they might be targeted. The third point I want to bring about definition, or about the whole conversation about anti-Semitism. And here I have a certain ambivalence about this issue. On the one hand, any conversation about anti-Semitism, it shouldn't be a conversation between the Jews and the Germans, as if this is exhaust the universe. There are people other than the Jews and the German in this conversation, or the European and the Jews. And the Palestinian must be there. His presence is critical by his mere presence. So there is a desire, or there is a need to include the Palestinians in this conversation. On the other hand, bringing the Palestinians into this conversation is always a risky thing. It's always going to a dangerous zone for the Palestinians, because whenever the Palestinians enter this dangerous zone, he almost lost something, because in this conversation, the ultimate victim is the Jews. The whole conversation is colored with the color of defending the Jews as the ultimate victim, while the Palestinian enters this conversation and he bears no responsibility for this historical victimhood. So he's entering a zone where actually he could be really marginalized as a victim. So there's, on the one hand, the Palestinian must be present in this conversation. On the other hand, we feel and we witness sometimes that people say, we don't want to enter this conversation. And the last point about definitions and more definitions about anti-Semitism raises a dilemma, a real dilemma. And the dilemma is the following. On the one hand, we have really a disastrous definition by the IHRA, and I will say a couple of words about the definition. And there is a really dire need to offer another definition that can compete with the IHRA. But usually what happens in these events is that when you have one definition and another definition and another definition, even the other definition is really competing or even contradicting the first definition, the buzz it creates around the issue of anti-Semitism, it creates as if the anti-Semitism is the only question around the world. Now, anti-Semitism must be combated. Anti-Semitism must be recognized as a disease for many societies, and educational and legal measures should be taken. But we also have to take things in proportion. There are many racists. There is Islamophobia in Europe, in the US. The Palestinians under occupation, they are still refugees, and we don't find the vocabulary even to start equivalent conversation about all these things. I want you to keep in mind when the Palestinians approach this issue of the definition of anti-Semitism. Now, I want to say something before I finish about content, about the IHRA and the JDA. And despite some some remarks on the phrasing of some of the articles of the GDA, I think it's a very important document. It's extremely important document as an intervention in a certain discourse. We're talking here about political intervention at a certain point in time. Philosophically, historically, one can say many things about the GDA, but that's not the issue. The issue is now contextual political intervention. Now, the IHRA, the problem with the IHRA, it's not that it's only makes really an attack on all Palestinians. But it's create a feeling within Palestinians, within Arabs in general, that if we conform with the IHRA, we have really to give up most of our rights. So that actually, if we want to insist on our rights, not to implement them, even to demand them, we would be accused being anti-Semitic. Now, this creates a feeling within many Arabs that if this is anti-Semitism, then probably we shouldn't be very worried to be accused of being anti-Semitic, because anti-Semitism is actually including everything around. And in this sense, the IHRA doing disservice to the question of real fight against anti-Semitism, because it can't recruit people from third world or the Arab world to fight real anti-Semitism that, as Stephanie said, coming mainly from white supremacists and right-wing groups in Europe. So instead actually of having more people on board, the IHRA kind of turn its back and say, actually, we don't give a damn if you are with us on this struggle against anti-Semitism. I think probably the most important aspect of the GDA, as I see it, is that it tries to bring two discourses into harmony, into consistency. And I think that Europe has two others. One other is the internal other, the Jew. And one universal lessons regarding the relation to the Jew in post-Holocaust is not another Holocaust. So one universalization comes from these lessons, how to treat the other within. But there is another universal lesson in post-World War II, and that of decolonization, that the promises of freedom and equality are not limited to Europe, and that this struggle against decolonization actually brings humanity into a new stage of equality and human rights in a universal sense. So that means that the struggle of the two others of Europe created two modes of universality, two political imagination that guides this universality vis-a-vis Europe. And the question is, if these two modes of universality, of these two modes of emancipation, can cohere, can be consistent with each other in a way that the struggle against anti-Semitism should not be used and abused in order to block or to stop any fight against for decolonization, for equality, for example, for the case of the Palestinians. And on the other hand, I think this coherence and consistency clearly should work the other way around, that struggles for equality in the third world by colonized people for their self-determination, for their decolonization, should cohere with the struggle against anti-Semitism in a way that they shouldn't flirt with terminologies, images, or ideas that actually could be thought or considered as anti-Semitic. One of the aims, and I think one of the moves that the GDA, I think, does, is to open this conversation, to allow this conversation, and to allow more people on board in the fight against anti-Semitism in a way that serves better the case of Israel-Palestine, because it's opened the space for a wider conversation, and it does also a better service for the fight against anti-Semitism, because it separates these two questions, the question of Israel-Palestine and the question of anti-Semitism, of hatred for the Jews as Jews. I would stop here. I would be glad to expand on some of the themes in the second round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raif. I am now introducing our third speaker, Amos Moriss-Reich. He's a professor at the Cohen Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Ideas, and the director of the Stephen Roth Institute for the Research of Contemporary Anti-Semitism and Racism, both at Tel Aviv University. Moriss-Reich's work intersects 19th and 20th century Jewish history and the history of science, and he has published extensively on anti-Semitism and racism in the history of the social and biological sciences. From his publications, I mention here only the co-edited volume, Ideas of Race in the History of the Humanities, and 3 monographs, The Quest for Jewish Assimilation in Modern Social Science, Race and Photography, Racial Photography as Scientific Evidence, and Photography and Jewish History, 5 20th century cases, which is now in press. Amos, please.
Thank you. And I want to join and say that I'm very happy that this event is taking place. And I want to thank everyone who was involved in preparing the event. And I want to thank Vivian for articulating the many issues that are at stake. And I want to stress that disagreement does not mean lack of respect. The structure of my talk is the following. First, I'll describe the perspective from which my short contribution is made, and very briefly, my argument. Second, I'll discuss 2 historical methodological issues pertaining to the history of anti-Semitism since 1945, and I will conclude with a suggestion for the direction of future efforts. First, my background. I've been working for many years on Jewish history and the history of the social and biological sciences, and I entered this discussion as a historian of anti-Semitism and racism. I have read many of the debates about the JDA, and as I hope will become clearer, my opposition comes from a different place. My argument in its most condensed form is this. First, we do not have an agreed concept of anti-Semitism from which we can deduce a shared definition. Second, what declarations can contribute to at best is the attempt to shape the horizons of what should count as tolerable speech in Western civil societies. In this sense, the JDA is counterproductive because rather than repudiate a certain class of speech, it implicitly legitimizes it by exempting it from the charge of anti-Semitism. I want to suggest that what we need to do, in fact, is to move in the opposite direction. That is, we should both acknowledge far more ambivalence in our current situation, and we should strive for a society that tolerates far less ambiguity in the use of language. That is, language in which criticism of Israel and Zionism maps onto animosity towards Jews. Not only do we not have an agreed concept of anti-Semitism from which we could derive definitions, but moreover, the problem with definitions in general is like the translation software tools we have on the internet. They work very well with unambiguous language, but they cannot cope with ambiguities. The problem is particularly acute with the JDA because the very cross-section of the anti-Semitism spectrum that it purports to deal with pertains to criticism of Israel and Zionism, that is, where a straightforward definition is least effective. For this reason, the JDA looks either like a particularly ineffective means towards a laudable end, or, as many of its critics read it, as basically a political instrument for exonerating left-wing criticism of Israel and Zionism from the charge of anti-Semitism. Because I do not think that the group that worked on the JDA meant for it to be a mere political instrument, I have a feeling that they may have been surprised that so many Israeli and European scholars of anti-Semitism, I know less about the United States, declined to sign it. This indicates that things are probably more complex than the authors of the JDA realized, and that the complexity involved here is not that of the left and right, because those who declined to sign it are not on the right. This complexity touches on something else related to the long history of ambivalence towards Jews, onto which criticism of Israel and/or Zionism is sometimes mapped. This is completely overlooked by the JDA. There are many ironies and inversions in our current discussion, but one is particularly important. And it is that for the authors of the JDA, I think it is easier to respond to criticism that comes from the political opponents on the right than it is to confront criticism from those within their own ranks. But this is a discussion that it is crucial to hold. This leads me to the two historical methodological remarks about the history of anti-Semitism, without which I believe it is not possible to understand why the JDA was written, but which are also the reasons why it falls short. Following the anti-Semitism of Nazism, the wider educated European, American, and Israeli public has to a great extent intuitively identified anti-Semitism with the right and the extreme right. In multiple ways, the extremity of Nazi anti-Semitism makes it harder to bring other of its facets back into the frame of discussion. But anti-Semitic views have historically been found within a wide spectrum of political outlooks with quite diverse forms of expression. Prominent political examples include the Soviet bloc, including its influence in the Arab and Muslim world, or various liberation movements in which the liberation of the masses was sometimes somehow tied to liberation from Jewish oppression. The JDA acknowledges the existence of anti-Semitism, but it situates it more or less exclusively on the right. Yet the real focus of the JDA, presenting itself as a corrective to the definition of the IRA, is on criticism of Israel and/or Zionism, which is found on the left. But here the JDA declares to a great extent a priori that criticism of Israel and/or Zionism are on the face of it unconnected to anti-Semitism. It is a priori because even though written mostly by historians, it does not apply historical or genealogical methods. This leads me to the second historical methodological point. This point pertains to the transformation with regard to the public expression of what prior to 1945 would have been legitimate beliefs, views, or images with regard to Jews, but which after 1945 has come to be counted as anti-Semitic. I believe that we historians are only in the first stages of grappling with this transformation, which introduces a variety of questions and complications on multiple registers. But the critical thing in the current context is that this transformation is correlated with the post-Holocaust and post-establishment of Israel era. And while in civil Western societies, it is no longer legitimate among intellectuals, scientists, or politicians to publicly express outright anti-Semitic views, this quick, sharp change could not and did not eradicate centuries of cultural, religious, and linguistic history. If in the first decades of the 20th century, as Shulamit Volkov has famously pointed out, anti-Semitism in Central Europe could be viewed as a cultural code, that is, a person could self-identify as an anti-Semite in the same way that one could identify as a Catholic, liberal, or communist, and a self-identification was accompanied with cultural and political baggage. After 1945, within Western civil societies, this is no longer the case. The word to emphasize in cultural code is code, because codes are by definition decodable. But since 1945, we are on much less stable ground. One could say that anti-Semitism has evolved from a cultural code into a semiotic problem. Semiotic signs, in opposition to codes, are much more intricate beings. In semiotics, as you surely know, it is the addressee, not the sender, which decides the meaning of the utterance. But of course, the simple semiotic framework only helps us to articulate the morphing of ambivalence toward Jews after 1945. It does not provide an answer because the social and political situations we're talking about are much more complex than the sender-addressee binary. No person, individual, or institution holds authority over whether an utterance, a statement, or an image crosses the threshold of anti-Semitism. The kinds of statements, expressions, and situations found on the left, or the kind, at least, that I'm talking about this evening, are not straightforward anti-Semitism found on the extreme right. They are much more evasive and ambiguous, and they are not owned as anti-Semitic by the people who make them. Let me give a few examples in order to explain why attempting to classify certain things as anti-Semitic is off target. A group of eminent German Protestant religious leaders visits Gaza. Shocked, they say that Gaza is like the Warsaw Ghetto. Palestinian leaders declare that the Jewish temple never existed on Temple Mount. In demonstrations in Paris, French Arabs shout that Jews should leave France where they do not belong and go to Palestine. Or French intellectuals claim that Jews instrumentalized their victim past for political purposes. Directly or indirectly, all these examples are related to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But in very complex ways, they also map onto ambivalence towards Jews. And it is very difficult to unpack how, because it is mostly by way of implication and insinuation. In any case, unpacking is also very different from classifying. Are they touched with anti-Semitism? If those who have made the statements reject the claim, does it make sense for someone else to characterize them as anti-Semitic? If yes, who? Based on what authority and using what criteria? But most importantly, for what purposes? My own sense is that I do not see much use in labeling persons or statements as anti-Semitic, but it should also be clear that they are in an in-between zone where it is not possible to exonerate them from the claim either. And this brings me to the final point in my talk, which pertains to the social, cultural, and political, but not legal in the narrow sense, which is toleration of expressions of ambivalence towards Jews. I want to suggest a more productive direction than definitions of anti-Semitism. What is required is for us to acknowledge more ambivalence in the situation, in the history of Israel, Zionism, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and in the criticism of Israel and Zionism, but to be less tolerant of ambiguity and criticism that maps onto language that is recognizable from anti-Jewish history. We need to acknowledge that Zionism and the state of Israel are deeply marked by ambivalence from the outset, because to a great extent they emerged in the face of and in response to European anti-Semitism and centuries of ambivalence toward Jews in European and Middle Eastern societies. This ambivalence is inescapable. To acknowledge ambivalence is to reject both that it is anti-Semitic, as well as to exonerate it from the claim. The examples I have given are not anti-Semitic, but they're also not free of anti-Semitism. The question of whether or not they are intentionally ambiguous is not primarily a legal question, but a social one, touching on the kinds and degrees of social toleration of ambivalence toward Jews, including in the context of criticism of Israel and Zionism. Here, what is called for is less toleration of ambiguity. So I'm coming back to what I've characterized as a semiotic problem, and I want to suggest that what we should demand and expect is sharper boundaries with regard to what counts as legitimate speech. By proclaiming that on the face of it, criticism of Israel and Zionism are separate from the history of anti-Semitism, the JDA is rather unfortunate, because in this way it implicitly legitimizes a problematic class of speech. This is also maybe part of the explanation why many scholars of anti-Semitism felt that they could not sign it, even though they are certainly not on the right. So to recapitulate, society should show less tolerance to the overlap between criticism of Israel and Zionism and language in which anti-Jewish motifs are implicated. This is, of course, a process, not something that can happen overnight. For instance, among the supporters of the BDS movement, the criticism being made often conflates the 1967 occupation, the 1948 borders, Zionism, the right of Jews to a state in Palestine, the right of Jews to any state at all, and collective Jewish existence as such. Let me be clear that the problem I'm pointing to here is not the political claims of the BDS movement, but its highly toxic, ambiguous language. I'm certain that political demands and political justifications can be made using much less ambiguous language, and I think they will be stronger that way. To be less tolerant to ambiguity in this case is to demand clarity with regard to the kinds or levels of criticism and their justifications. For instance, I find it very different if supporters of the one-state solution justify that solution based on the fact that at this stage it is impossible to divide the land between the Jewish and the Palestinian peoples, or if on the other hand they justify it based on a denial that the Jews are a nation, or a claim that they are European settler colonialists with no connection to the land. This may be a long political educational process, but following the demand for disambiguation, we will need to be much more resolute in admitting that the use of ambiguous of language is deliberate. Our model here can be that of gender, where social tolerance of the use of language in certain ways is changing quite dramatically before our eyes. I do not think ambivalence towards Jews, Judaism, and Jewish history will disappear anytime soon. But I think we can demand that criticism of Israel and or Zionism strives, as clearly as language allows, to distinguish itself from the history of ambivalence towards Jews. And the responsibility for this should be placed much more clearly on the critics of Israel and Zionism. This is the challenge of civil society. It lies at first and foremost at the feet of the educated, liberal, and left side of the political map. And this is possibly the most important thing to which we, scholars and intellectuals, can contribute, namely, working towards a shared language that will enable us to formulate our disagreements, which is a condition for dealing with our current and future political challenges. Thank you.
Amos, thank you very, very much. Thanks to all three of you. I would like to now invite you to, after having listened to the other two speakers, to gather your thoughts and make statements from your point of view concerning these other positions. Yes, please. Stephanie, go ahead.
I'm afraid, yes, I'm afraid I'm the first one, and it's not so easy to try now to respond to 30 minutes of intellectual firework from both of my colleagues, and I will certainly miss out a lot of things. And I will start with Amos. Certainly we both share that, the inkling that it's much, as a historian, it's easier to talk about ambivalences than about definitions. But absolutely, I agree. And I told you what I think about how much I like definitions in general. But I didn't really get, and maybe you can explain it again, or maybe we have to discuss this for the next years to come, the difference in, when it on the ground, what you say to be on the one hand to acknowledge the ambivalence in the image of the Jew, etc., and on the other hand to be less tolerant in expressions and in coded speech when it comes to Israel. So I think that is exactly what the JDA is trying to disentangle, and of course no definition is perfect, and we are very much aware of that the JDA is not the new holy grail, but it's at least it's something. It's the best we could do in a certain moment of time, exactly to do what you ask for, to disentangle ambivalence, and at the same time to be clear. And this is necessary, I think, because of the political situation. And by the way, just in parentheses, I have to say this, of course, anti-Semitism is not only linked to the right, but there is mentioning in the definition on images like the Jew as capitalist, as Rothschild, encoded language, etc., etc., etc. So it's not, we tried to be as broad as possible, and of course, we did not overlook this. But as I said in my very beginning, there is apparently a politically, a civil, educational and civil society need to be, to have some clarity. And I think that's the reason why we do, and I don't think we get far in the political sphere when talking about ambivalence and non-ambivalence. Very much so, and now, again, I don't want to bore you with the peculiar German context, and Raif is certainly right, there are not only Germans and Jews in the world, but you also have it, the IRA is being used politically. It's not legally binding, but it's being used as a political instrument. It's being used in the UK, in order for the universities to accept this, etc. And so many German town administrations like Munich and Frankfurt have adopted it, and that has political consequences about who is speaking and who is not speaking in certain spaces. So I do think it's a political situation that, like it or not, creates a need for greater clarity. That's one point. And the other point is, for me, I think, and this is, now I'm referring also to Raif, and you mentioned, is what we need is a separation from the discussion and debate on anti-Semitism and from the Israel-Palestine conflict. And now I'm talking not politically, but as a historian, that was maybe 20 years ago. I listened to a talk in Hamburg by a colleague from Budapest. He was given a talk called Anti-Semitism in Hungary. And he started with saying the Jews were predominantly occupied in business and in banks, and they were richer than the average, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we had a huge conflict because, you know, people would say, me among them, that anti-Semitism in the first place has nothing to do with the role with the Jews on the ground, but it's something that is an emotional and political or whatever need in the anti-Semitic societies or in the anti-Semites. So this old, and you can find it and you know it very well in books also after 45, this kernel of truth theory, that there was always a bit of truth in anti-Semitism. I think this has been laid to bury already some years ago in our field, and I think rightly so. But the situation, and you know it, both of you, all of you much better than I do, the situation in Israel and Palestine is profoundly different in the sense that there is a real conflict. It's not a kernel of truth, it's a conflict. And this, of course, you are right, it's Amos now again, it's getting symbolized and, you know, put into pictures or whatever by the huge cultural baggage of anti-Semitism in both monotheistic religions as Christianity and Islam. So it's not, you know, of course, this is exactly what is at the core of our conversation. How do we liberate the discussion on a conflict from the cultural baggage that comes along with all the participants? And I think that's what the JDA is trying to do. And yeah, I still think I think we have to do it politically, and I think we did quite a good job. Thank you.
Thank you. Raif, please. Can you just unmute?
Yeah, thank you. Probably most of my comments are to Amos, who brought to the surface serious questions. But as far as I remember the GDA, I was there most of the time. So it's most of the examples are prima facie. On the face of it could be anti-Semitic or anti-Semitic, and everybody can prove otherwise, given the context, the intent, and the circumstances. So it's not clear cut. We left, that was left open pretty much. But I didn't hear you say anything about the IHRA in your presentation. So are those defects our lack of possibility to make definition, the ambivalence? I mean, is that right as well to the IHRA, or do you live with the IHRA? And if you can't live with the IHRA, why is that? Now, but there is a moment where I think we start to disagree, and we disagree in many ways politically, or levels of anxieties probably. And I want to ask you, is claiming Israel a settler colonial state, is this in itself anti-Semitic? Or for example, a position that says that the partition plan in 1947 was unjust, is that by definition anti-Semitic? Look, I ask by definition. Everything could be anti-Semitic. I mean, you can be pro-Israel for anti-Semitic reasons. We know, we can claim that Trump in many ways was anti-Semitic. And I want to push these questions actually really. So do you think that insisting on the right of return, which actually ends the Jewish state and create a demographic change where probably Jews and Arab are balanced, or probably the Palestinians outnumber the Jews? So is that anti-Semitic in your... Now, of course, Probably some people want to do that because they hate the Jews, but I want to ask you, on the face of it as a demand, if we don't have an X-ray, because if you want to speak about intentions, I don't have an X-ray, and everybody in the heart of his or her heart, there might be anti-Semitic motives actually to outnumber the Jews, okay, to render them minority and strip them of their rights. But can really one argue that claiming right of return is anti-Semitic in itself? That amounts to saying that actually expelling people from their homes or turning them into stateless is something is mandated by the fight against anti-Semitism. I don't think that anti-Semitism should be really take this huge burden on itself to say that actually in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, to claim that Palestinians have no right to go back. So this would be legitimizing horrors, legitimizing ethnic cleansing in the name of, let's say, full equality, individual and collective, from the sea to the river, in the form of state of all its citizens, dismantling the JNF, because as long as there are Jewish bodies that holds big chunks of the land that dedicated to the Jews, and only to the Jews that by definition put the Palestinians as a second order citizen, or abolishing the law of return. Now I can see why all that might be problematic in terms of Jewish anxiety, probably in terms of this was create the stability, or probably that this will perpetuate the conflict. I can see that. But do you want to argue that these are anti-Semitic? I think that would be really pushing the limits too much. To ask Israel really to change its constitutional structure completely. That would change the essence of Israel, but that doesn't mean necessarily the existence. At one point, we don't know what's the difference between existence and essence. Is South Africa post-apartheid is the same South Africa under the apartheid? In many ways, it's the same. It's the same territory, populations, etc. So I think that there is a limit how much you can push the concept. And there are many things that we should use in life, many tools. For example, reason. People should be reasonable. People should take consideration of safety, of stability, of security, of prosperity. So I think that one can dispel many arguments. One can be against many solutions, but without deploying anti-Semitism. I think to deploy anti-Semitism as racism as well, very fast in the conversation, I think this is one should really think about it carefully. So I'm not sure if you are really against all what I said, because I'm just putting this, I'm pushing the limit that in the Palestinian-Israeli case, we witnessed one people came, took the land of another. I know the details. I know 100 years of conflict. But at the end of the day, the one people that they were refugees, persecuted in Europe, took the land of another people, expelled part of them, and the other part remained under occupation. This is the context. And I think in this context, probably one should really be careful when speaks about the conflict and the Palestinians. When speaking about Europe, I think you would find me a real ally there in this sense of free hatred for the Jews. I would stop now. Anyway, I took too much time.
Raif, thank you very much. Amos, your turn before we open the floor to our listeners. Yes.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for the two talks. I think with quite a lot I actually agree, and I think with many of the comments that Raif now made, actually I think we're closer than he realized. I do have a few comments. First of all, we're talking today about the JDA. So we're not talking about definitions or the history of definitions of anti-Semitism. We're talking about one particular effort. And my question would first of all be, do we, I mean, is this really what we need? Another definition of anti-Semitism? Well, this is first of all my question. And I think maybe, I think at least part of the way I understand, this is already to answer part of Raif's question about IRA, at least my reading of the situation is that, well, I said I don't see much use in definition, so I also don't see a lot of use in IRA definition. But I think if I have to choose between the IRA and the JDA, I definitely prefer the IRA definition. And I think before we arrive at the instrumentalization, political instrumentalization, for instance, by the Israeli government, before we arrive at that, I think at least my reading of what's going on is that what the IRA does in a very general way, with all the shortcomings of a definition, is that it is a bit pushing in the direction that I suggested, which is to try and differentiate between what is anti-Semitic and between what is legitimate criticism of Israel and Zionism. And so I think in terms of what the JDA actually did or is attempting to do is a bit in the opposite direction, in the wrong direction, because again, by going to a definition, but adding a different one and excluding in practice the entire class of criticism of Israel and Zionism, what it does is actually, it says just a moment. If we say that criticism of Israel and Zionism is actually problematic, what we're doing is we're weakening the claims of the Palestinians or the supporters to express their views. And I was trying to say the opposite. I was trying to say that I think what's happening and what we should encourage is this very long and difficult process, which is a social, educational, civil process, where we attempt as best as we can, and we, I think intellectuals and scholars can contribute to this, to say almost any criticism of Israel and Zionism, you can formulate in a way which will not conflate with anti-Jewish language. And we should drive in that direction. This is basically what I'm saying. I think it does become at some stage, difficult in terms of history, and some of your historical description, I do not agree with Raif. But because at some stage it is, you put hard questions about, is it legitimate to make this and this and this claim? I think it is possible to make them in a way which will almost completely be devoid of anti-Jewish language. And I think, and this is what I'm saying, we should encourage, this direction to differentiate between, and I think in terms of countering instrumentalization of anti-Israel and anti-Zionist criticism, what I'm suggesting would greatly strengthen the criticism, because it would be much harder to disqualify. And so I think I a bit disagree with Stephanie, who suggested that we can contribute another definition, we historians mean. I think no, I think our task as intellectuals, as historians, as legal scholars, as philosophers, is not to allow for a politicized simplification of the picture. No, we should insist on complicating the picture of using as subtle and as accurate language as we can. And I don't think this will not damage and not weaken. I think the other side of the implementation of the IRA, which I think maybe the authors of the JDA overlook, is that what it does is actually, it does not weaken the criticism of Israel. And it does not legitimize things that are done by Israel. What it does is it tries to draw a line with regards to how to formulate the criticism. You spoke about form, Raif, and I think this is welcome. Now, I do want to say a note, something about the left and right, which came up in both Stephanie's and your comments, and I tend to disagree with both of you. I think there are many people, Jewish, Israelis, who find the criticism coming from the left much more threatening than that coming from the right. And it's also inaccurate to say that violence is mostly from the right, because for instance, in France, the violence is from the left. The actual violence, the terror attacks against Jews in France is not from the right, it's from the left. And I think the JDA could have done a much stronger work there, and it didn't. Let me see if there's anything else I want to say. I do want to say maybe one kind of basic thing, which is that when we historians speak about intention, we usually recreate the intention out of the context. And so, for instance, there are forms of criticism of Zionism and Israel of various kinds, which we can, through historical methods, recreate something which does touch on anti-Semitism. Historically, this is the case. And so by declaring that prima facie it's not the case, I think this is an error. It's both an error kind of in the narrow historical sense, but it's also an error in the sense of what we want to say to the public. What is our responsibility in saying to the public? Do we want to legitimize a certain class of speech, irrespective of the fact that I don't see much sense in, this is where I don't see much sense in saying about something that it's anti-Semitic or not. This was the basic thing which I tried to say in my talk. But if pushed to the wall, yes, we historians can say about certain forms of criticism of Israel and Zionism that their sources, their intentions, their forms of speech, their signifiers, they interface with the history of anti-Semitism. That's not a question at all. That's a fact. I'll leave it here. I'm sure there are questions from the audience.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to invite all the listeners to put their questions into the chat. They will then appear in the question and answers. We have for now 3 questions, and sometimes they actually say who they're addressed to. So Shiko Bahar asks Amos, it's odd that I couldn't understand from your words if you prefer IRA or JDA. What's your position? Now, I think that you have made it clearer in the second round, but Amos, do you want to add something? You're still muted.
If I have to choose, I would choose the IRA. I think it makes a better work because it doesn't exclude one class from its from its coverage. So the JDA, as compared, is it takes out exactly the section which is the most contentious one, which is unfortunate.
Thank you. Dennis Bart Mergitz asks to all the speakers, isn't it naive at best or bad faith at worst to say that any attempt at a definition of anti-Semitism wants to be non-legally binding? The only real consequences are always legal or at least paralegal. Yes, Stephanie.
Yeah, very briefly on that. And I think Raev, as a lawyer, has much more to say about this. But I think we are not lawyers. I mean, the majority of those who are dealing with definitions are not, didn't study law and are not persons in the position to establish anything close to a law. So it's not naive. It's just, you know, there's a saying that, I don't know, the shoemaker should stick to his whatever. I mean, everyone can do what, you know, what is within one's own academic realm. And so it's not naive and it's not bad faith. It's an offer to discuss. And of course, these definitions, such as the IRA, have been used as the grounds for, not for legislation, but for recommendations, which then have political effect. And that is exactly at the core of the problem, basically, about the political effects that the IRA has had in Europe. And one colleague who actually is a law professor, he explained it as, I mean, even the BDS resolution of the Bundestag is not a law. It's just a statement of will, which, by the way, would be unconstitutional if it became law. So I think this makes it very clear that we are here on a very difficult ground. And that is why I think as I said, I'm not a fan of definitions. Apparently we need them, but we need those who would not be declared unconstitutional, to put it very frankly. So yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Raef, would you like to, as a lawyer, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I would like, I'd like to say something about the IHRA, the non-legal or so-called non-legal. But as a matter of fact, it became soft law. So in terms of procedure, it didn't go through the process of legal making, but it slowly becomes sort of soft law adopted by so many institutions that can exert their power, censorship, etc. So it bites, actually. But the GDA, I think I can testify that it was made bona fide, in good faith, that they didn't want to have it as a legal document. But I have a question to Amos to clarify his position. Can I put a question?
Of course.
Amos, in the IRA definition, the denial of the Jews' right for self-determination in Israel-Palestine is anti-Semitic. What do you understand of this right? So is the right, for example, for right of return? Because one of the things that include in the right for self-determination is full control of the border. Does that mean that the Palestinian demand for return, which might change demographic, is that anti-Semitic, do you think?
So first, I want also to say something about the legal aspect. I said in my talk that I don't consider declarations, not the IRA, also not the JDA, as able to contribute anything in the narrow legal sense. But I do think that laws and declarations of this kind, in a sense, are in this direction. Values are embedded in them. So when there's a declaration which says it's not about prosecuting someone, I don't see any British sociologists in jail as yet or in prison, but it is about shaping the horizon of expectable speech. And in this sense, I think the IRA, again, with all its shortcomings, I'm not for definitions. So I want to remind you that the adoption of the IRA was following the Labour under Corbyn course of events. So it didn't come out of nowhere. It came in a context. And but to your question, Raif, I was trying to say, I gave the example of the one-state solution in my talk, and I think I was trying to move as far as I possibly can away from wanting to determine whether a political demand is anti-Semitic or not. But I think what's important is the justification which is given. And when you look at the justification, certain justifications seem to be, to me, very problematic, and others not, even if the political demand is the same. That's the point I was trying to make.
Amos, thank you. And we have a third question that is somewhat theoretical and at the same time goes in the opposite direction. The question by Thomas Froy is, could the speaker say something about why they are or are not ambivalent about definitions? Phrases such as by definition, on the face of it, in itself, have been used, but is anti-Semitism ever practiced except in practice rather than in theory? Yes.
I'm willing to answer.
Okay.
I think as far as I could see, we are all ambivalent, but even ambivalent tending against definitions altogether, all three of us, I think. So if I'm, this is the impression at least I got. But the question is whether we can be ambivalent from the other side. So Stephanie did actually say that, yes, actually there is some benefit in turning to definitions. I'm more ambivalent than Stephanie in this sense. I don't see, but I agree with the latter point that you can't capture. I mean, it's not unique in any sense. Anti-Semitism is not unique in this sense, but also other similar, forms of social life are also not graspable by theory. And so in this sense, we're a bit like chasing the tail of ourselves, something like that.
Thank you. Thanks. Raif?
I mean, I'm mute. As far as I remember the GDA, it's a definition that try not to be a definition in a way, because the whole structure of on the face of it, the prima facie structure, it allows room for the definition to change. So kind of saying on the face of it, it is anti-Semitic, or on the face of it, it's not anti-Semitic, but I'm open for persuasion if you bring me other evidence on the matter. And second, I think the JDA in the introduction tried to bring the issue of context, intention, persistence, repeatability. So all of those actually is kind of an invitation to use our sober, good reasoning, good sense of judgment. So it's extremely a flexible, relatively flexible definition as far as I remember it.
Thank you. Stephanie, you want to? No. We then go on to another question by Nick Rabat. He asks, the IRA states, however, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. Do you think that people opposing the IRA always have this in mind? So this is a question about whether one even follows IRA's limitations. Yes, Raif, would you like to reply?
I'm not sure that I understand the question. This is one of the problems with the IHRA. I think the IHRA have several problems. This is one of them. The other that to claim that denying the right of Jews to right of self-determination without saying what is included in the right of self-determination, I think it's problematic, because it makes that any claim for right of return is anti-Semitic, not to mention that Israel is never declared where its border ends. But there's something in the music of the IRA which is problematic. The problematic music of the IRA, that it doesn't pose a principle and that needs to be actually balanced by other principles. And it doesn't set an interpretive framework that puts the rights of all people, the UN Declaration and other declaration against racism as a frame that allows us actually to make balance between the different rights. Now, if you have a right that is not balanced by other rights, by other principles of international law, then this right resides higher than other rights and becomes like a privilege. So there is something in the IRA that says, look, we're giving the Jews a certain prerogative. Now let's the rest of the world manage. Let's them figure out how to relate to this. There's something in the GDA that says there's no lexical priority, that first you do something to the Jews and then let's think about the rest of the universe. No, it's at the same time, it's a relational document that when you think about X, you have to think about Y at the same time. And this music is problematic in the IRA as a music.
Thank you, Stephanie or Amos, do you want to still respond to this? If not, I would like to ask you, each one of you, in the order in which you talked, to give just 1 or 2 sentences to close our discussion, maybe involving the hope that this kind of debates can create a dialogue between people who hold different views. Yes, Stephanie, please.
Yeah, thank you. Before I do this, just one small remark to Amos. I think it's important to remember that the IRA first, I mean, the first definition in this context, I mean, the IRA is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, as we know, and it was in 2004. And at that time, the real problem in the room was the attacks on the meaning of the Holocaust in the former Soviet bloc. And the attempts, you might remember this, putting to jail former Jewish partisans for killing Lithuanian policemen, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a different context, and this context has not vanished, you know? And I think it's important to have this in mind. But that's just the first remark. The second, what I hope, I mean, and it's also a little bit, again, to Amos, I mean, you know me very well, and I'm an academic, and I don't like to write definitions. I would never write a book on definitions. I want to write a book on the blood purity laws and their persistence in Europe until today. But as Bertolt Brecht said, die Verhältnisse, die sind nicht so. The situation is not like that. And as a citizen of my country and as a political person, I feel worried about the direction that this discussion has been taking. And that's why I participated in this writing process, because I do hope, and this is what I still think, I do hope that the GDA is able to open up a space to separate the anti-Semitism issue from the issue of Israel-Palestine, as I said before, and to open up a discussions like the ones we are having now. And I think these discussions are very, very much needed, not only in Israel, but also in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Raif, please.
I think despite some comments, remarks, reservation that I have on the GDA, I think the GDA is an important document. It opens the space for a new conversation that allows a new dialogue to take place. And I think those in the forefront in the fight for anti-Semitism should think and imagine that when anti-Semitism is, the fight against anti-Semitism is reformulated in a way that cohere with the universal human rights, they should expect, and the Palestinians should expect from themselves, to be at the first row to fight against anti-Semitism. And this is, I think, should be something to guide those who wants to initiate and to guide the fight against anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Thank you, Raef. And finally, Amos.
Yes, I have a lot to say, but rather I will thank my colleagues because it was enlightening, and I found myself agreeing much more with what I heard than I thought. And to say again that I think this the discussion is very, very important. So I hope it will continue.
I want to thank all of you for an exciting and illuminating discussion. I think that for many of our listeners, this has indeed fulfilled the expectation of gaining greater clarity about the implications of these definitions, and maybe the problems of definitions as such, but also beyond that, both of the difficulty and complexity of the situation, but also of the possibility to sit together, at least virtually, and speak. So thank you very much to all of you, and still a nice evening.